Okay, so this should be a fun one and potentially annoy people that have just bought a TT bike. So we've got two things really to consider, I think. Firstly, whether a TT bike for triathlon is a worthwhile investment, but then secondly, whether it's the most appropriate choice for your goal race or races that you're planning to do in the future. So I think the first thing really just to kind of make really clear is that TT bikes are expensive. There's a bit of a premium on them, full stop. But then one thing that people don't necessarily appreciate before they buy them is to fit well onto a TT bike and get into a good aerodynamic position, etc., to be able to hold power as well. You effectively have to customize it, and so the cost can quickly snowball. Just a quick point though, if you perhaps decide that you can't afford an out-and-out TT bike, one of the typical compromises is to go for clip-on aero bars on a road bike. So my personal feelings on that, actually, you can probably hold a better position on your road bike without clip-on aero bars. For me, they're a bit too much of a fudge, and basically what it comes down to is closing your hip angle and your body's positioning relative to the bottom bracket. And with clip-on aero bars, it tends to be just too much of a compromise, and you can often just hold a much better, more aerodynamic position and get good power by sitting on the drops or just kind of resting on top of the hoods. So that's just one thing to kind of throw into the mix as well. I know a fair amount of people will probably disagree with me on that one, and some much smarter people than I, but that's just my personal feelings on it. But back to the TT bike, it's very expensive and you're probably going to have to customize it. So that's things like getting a different headset, maybe a shorter one, or maybe one that's raised at a certain angle, buying new aero bars or skis, as cyclists like to call them, that are more adjustable, because typically the aero bars that you get with a bike, they tend to be massively adjustable. New saddle potentially. The kind of trend these days is to go for shorter cranks as well. So various bits and pieces that you might have to buy and adjust, and also just to throw something else in there, wheels. So for a triathlete, you're going to want to spend a lot of time on your TT bikes, particularly if you're doing long course triathlon, and so you're probably going to either need a set of really durable wheels or two sets, because training on something like these all the time, they're just going to fall apart because they're not really built to do long distance and lots of training on. So yeah, there's another expense, potentially two sets of wheels, a training set and then a racing set. So yeah, I think perhaps that's enough kind of going on about the expense of time trial bikes. But another thing to consider is you need good mobility to ride one of these things properly. So if you suffer from particularly tight hamstrings, tight kind of mobility issues, you want to address that first before you start to think about buying a TT bike. And that's because I really recommend getting a bike fit before you buy a time trial bike. And that's because really you want proper good advice on the frame size, the geometry that's going to work best for you, and then to any other potential kind of customizations that you'll need to do. And if you're doing that with kind of poor mobility, which may well change, then you're going to have to do it all over again in sort of, I don't know, 6 months to a year's time. But also, I think the more fundamental point there is, if you've got poor mobility and you're not be able to hold a very good position on a time trial bike, there's no point really, because in my opinion, going back to kind of like on aero bars, you might actually be better and able to hold a more aerodynamic position on a road bike by being on the drops or lying on top of the hoods than being on the aero bars. I've seen it quite a few times actually at races and kind of with people I've met. Their position on the TT bike is so poor that actually not really getting much aerodynamic benefit, and they're also suffering from power loss because of that closed hip angle where they're unable to produce power in the same way. So a whole host of things to really consider before you buy a TT bike. And the final one that I would just suggest, if for a triathlete this is, if you're sold on getting a TT bike, get one with disc brakes. Honestly, so this is a rim brake bike, and it is horrible concealed aero brakes. And the weather, I've done a couple of races in bad weather this year, and it was terrifying. Honestly, if I was investing in a TT bike now, I would not be getting one with rim brakes. I would be getting one with disc brakes, and there would be no compromise on that. So that's one thing to really kind of consider. And obviously availability is a big issue at the moment for pure cyclists, for pure time trialists. Obviously the brakes doesn't matter as much because it's unlikely that they're going to be kind of doing anything as technical, being on a bike long enough for it to be as much of an issue. Obviously still very much a consideration, but not as big of an issue. So yeah, moving on to which option. Say you got both, or money's not a problem. Which one would you go for in terms of your choice for your race? So the amount of climbing is obviously the obvious consideration, but just kind of two kind of nuances to throw in. Firstly, the type of climbing is important. So if you've got long, steady climbs and you can actually hold quite a good climbing position on your bike, then yeah, why not? Particularly if there's quite long flats as well, where you can actually get the benefit of being in a more aerodynamic position. And then likewise, if you've got just short punchy climbs and then long flat sections, the amount of climbing it's the type of climbing really, and your ability to climb on your TT bike, which I think is perhaps the more specific consideration. For me though, the major thing to think about is the gearing. So if you've got some big heavy gearing on your TT bike and you can't just change it, swap it out really easily, that for me is kind of the biggest consideration when it comes to the course. So if you've got like a compact or something on your TT bike, there may well be some flat sections, but if you can still hold a pretty good aero position on your roadie, and you also got a more appropriate gearing, that might be the better option. Because guys, for triathletes, you've got to remember, you're going to be running after the bike. So, you might be able to get a super aero position, the gearing you can just about live with, etc. But if you're all cramped up and your hamstrings are spasming, you're not going to run well after it. So throw that into the mix when you're considering which option to go for. And then weather. Going back to the brake consideration, weather is such an important one. I had, as I said, a couple of scary races this year, and I really wish I'd been on my road bike with disc brakes during those. So the road bike is just so much more stable. If you think about kind of where your weight is, typically a time trial bike will have quite a light front end, and that's because obviously you're putting weight over the front when you're resting on the aero bars. And so when you're sitting up on a wet descent, and perhaps there's an off-camber corner, etc., you basically got a very light front end, and that can be a little bit sketchy. So just want to think about the weather as well. And if you've got the option of switching between the two, then you might want to take safety first on that one. So that is, I think, a bit of a whistle-stop tour of TT versus road bike. I'm not trying to put you off the TT bike, but I would like everybody to kind of be a little bit more aware of where they're putting their money and some of the pitfalls that you can go down. So just make sure you spend a bit of time really kind of thinking it through and doing your research. And of course, as always, guys, if you've got any questions, anything you want to run past us, just drop us a DM, or you can email us at info@riak.fitness. And yeah, whichever way you go, just have a bit of fun.